All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry I couldn't be there today. I am not feeling well, but I still have a lecture ready for you. I still have notes ready for you. The show will still go on. So we are still in the middle of our Civil War unit. Today's lesson is on Chapter 9, Lesson 3 from our book. The chapter is called Life During the War. Today's essential question is, should war be conducted against both military and civilian populations? So is it okay in war to attack civilians? Civilians are like the regular people. Or should it be strictly soldiers fighting and military targets? Our world has a long, long history of attacking civilians. So that's the essential question today. Should it be conducted against both the military population and the civilian population, or just the military population? If you need a moment to finish writing the essential question in your notes, go ahead and pause the video here. Otherwise, we'll keep going. All right, so we're going to start off with wartime economies. This slide will focus on the economy of the South. The next slide will focus on the economy of the North. As we've discussed previously, the South experienced runaway inflation because they didn't really have a good source of income on their own while they were separated from the North. They thought everyone was so dependent on their cotton that was going to make them all this money. But because of the war, Europe and the Union weren't buying their cotton anymore. Also, they printed extra money, but printing money doesn't equate making money. So the South experienced runaway inflation. There were also parts of the South that were occupied by Union troops, which made farming even more difficult. The Union had set up blockades in the South, so nothing could get in or out of their ports. And the Union was doing a lot to cut off their transportation. We talked about the Anaconda Plan last week. The South was slowly being choked. All of these factors led to a lot of food shortages. Many men deserted the army to go home to return to their families. But many men still were out in the battlefield, so mobs and mobs of women were raiding shops in order to get food, clothing, shoes, bread. You can see in this picture, that's what the women and children are after. You can see people trying to run out of there with bread. This was a very, very hard time for the Southerners. And if you can tell in this drawing, these women come from all socioeconomic backgrounds. We can tell by their clothing that this is a mixture of upper and lower class women. Go ahead and pause here to finish taking the notes. The Northern economy also suffered, but the North did a really good job of responding to the need of a wartime economy. They actually were able to experience an economic boom because 90% of the industry was in the North. So the North was actually making money from supplying uniforms, supplying guns, supplying bullets, cannons, everything you need for a war, the Union was able to produce. So they were actually making a lot of money off and profiting off the war, as oftentimes in America we do. Another thing, all the industrialization in the machines, there was a lot of new advancements in farming, which made it possible for women to do a lot of the farming at home. This is also around when we start to see a few factories popping up, and technology is making a lot of jobs a little easier and making it possible for women to replace men in all these factory jobs while the men go off to war. So they were also able to keep their economy going by women going to work. Excuse me, I'm sorry. However, it wasn't all peace and hunky-dory in the North. Riots were still breaking out over conscription. If you recall, conscription is a draft. Under this conscription law, all men between 20 and 45 were eligible to serve in the military. However, if a man could find a replacement or pay a $300 fee, he did not have to serve in the military. Well, obviously, a rule like that is going to be favorable to wealthy men, and poor men are going to have to go serve. So this created a lot of anger and rioting. Some of the biggest riots took place in New York City. Go ahead and pause here to finish the notes from this slide. All right, so the new main idea for African Americans in the military. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which essentially freed all the slaves in the country. When he did this, that made it possible for African American men to join the United States Army and the United States Navy, in the Union, that is. Two sons of Frederick Douglass served in the military. Frederick Douglass was really happy about this. He saw this as a way that Black men could overcome racial prejudices. And many Black people saw this as an opportunity to prove themselves. One of the most infamous, most valiant, bravest regiment was actually from Massachusetts. They became pretty famous. I don't know how many. The movie Glory, starring Denzel Washington, is a really famous, really good movie. I'm not allowed to show it in class because it's rated R. So I don't know how many of you have seen it. But the story of this group of men from Massachusetts and what they did during the Civil War and holding on to Fort Wagner in Charleston Harbor. I'm obviously lost for words, but the part I want you to really focus on and really think about is that these men came from Massachusetts. They were already free. They were not fighting for their freedom. They were fighting to prove themselves, to gain a mutual respect from the rest of the country, fighting for the freedom of their peers. What they did for the Union in the Civil War, laying down their lives. Half of them were killed in this battle. Nearly 200,000 African Americans served in the Union side of the Civil War, very bravely, very valiantly. There's absolutely no question of whether or not they proved themselves on the battlefield. Go ahead and pause here to finish the notes for this slide. All right, we're going to move on to what life was like in the military. It was a really hard time for men serving in the military during the Civil War. Men in the North were not used to rationing their water. There's a story about men marching, and they pick some berries while they're marching, and they use their canteen to wash off the berries before they eat them. And it didn't even occur to them that, hello, like, you're marching, you need that. They ran out of water, and they had to continue the rest of their march with no water because they weren't used to having to make their things go a long way. They weren't used to not just being able to get a drink of water whenever you want. Their meals were made out of hardtack. Hardtack is one of your vocab words, which is like a really hard biscuit made out of flour. They often ate potatoes and beans. No question, it was much harder for the South. They did not have a well-supplied army, and they did not have a well-funded government to give them supplies. Southern soldiers often did not have boots or would have to sleep without a blanket. And because of the food shortages happening in the South, they also had very little food at all. Go ahead and pause here to finish the notes. So I don't know how much you've heard about medicine during the Civil War. It was absolutely just atrocious. The Civil War was brutal. We've talked about how men were just blown apart on the battlefield. And then you've got doctors who don't even understand yet how infection and disease and germs are spread. They would use the same dirty instruments on patient after patient after patient. So the doctors were actually spreading infection even more so. They would often have to amputate limbs to keep infection from spreading. Antibiotics didn't exist yet. So if you were injured on your hand or your foot, you would usually have to lose your whole arm or your whole leg so that your whole body didn't get infected and you would die. There were no antibiotics to stop that. So they would use the same saw to cut off your leg and to cut off his leg and to cut off his arm. They didn't have anesthesia to put you to sleep yet. Sometimes they had chloroform that would kind of put you to sleep, but they often ran out of chloroform. They'd literally give you some shots of whiskey and amputate while you were awake. Civil War medicine was absolutely atrocious. And as if that wasn't bad enough, something most people don't know is actually 2/3 of Civil War soldiers died from disease. They would be living in these quote-unquote hospitals. They're not real hospitals. It's somebody's house. It's where you could set up a tent. They'd be in cramped quarters. There'd be a lot of sick people all in one place. They would not have clean water. Smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia are the top 4 things that Civil War soldiers died from. Dysentery and typhoid both come from drinking dirty water. It's really unfortunate how many people died of things that are kind of easily preventable, but people just didn't know any different yet. Go ahead and pause here to finish the notes on this slide. Another change to actually come out of Civil War battle medicine is nurses. In 1861, Elizabeth Blackwell started the first training program for nurses. And Elizabeth Blackwell is the first woman to become a physician in the United States. Clara Barton, who is the woman pictured here on the slide, she worked in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. Patents Office. And during the war, she felt like she could be more helpful in the battlefield. She used her organizational skills to triage patients. So So triage is actually what happens anytime you go to the emergency room. You talk to the triage nurse, and she determines how sick you are, like a level 1, a level 2, a level 3. Like if someone has chest pains, they're like at the top of the list. They're the first one to go in. If you were in a car accident, boom, you're in. If you had a heart attack, someone whose life is in immediate danger is at the top of the list. Someone who has a cold is going to be put at the bottom of the list. She invented this triage system to determine who needed help first, who needed help right this second, or they were going to die, who could wait an hour or two, who can wait a day or two. She invented this system of who to help and in what order to help them. She was also brilliant at distributing medical supplies where they were needed. Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross. A woman named Kate Cummings set up makeshift hospitals in the South. The same way the black soldiers were helping break down barriers for African Americans, these women in nursing really helped break down the belief that women are weaker than men. Women were also fighting to break down barriers during the Civil War. People thought women are too soft, they can't handle seeing the horrors of war, which honestly no one should see the horrors of war. But these women really proved themselves that they could get out there and get dirty and do what needs to be done, even with all the frightening chaos surrounding them. Go ahead and pause here to finish the notes on this slide. All right, military prisons. This will be our last slide for the day. Prisoners during the Civil War suffered tremendously. At first, early in the war, both sides would exchange prisoners. You know, the Union captured 10,000 men and the South captured 10,000 men, and they would trade their prisoners back to each other. However, after the Emancipation Proclamation, when Lincoln freed the slaves, the South refused to free black men in exchange for white Southern men. If black men were captured by the South, they would either put them back into slavery, and remember, some of them were never slaves to begin with, or they would be killed. So in response to the way the South was treating black men, Lincoln just stopped all prisoners exchanges altogether. But, you know, as we've discussed, the South couldn't even feed their own people. So they weren't trying really hard to feed the Northern prisoners of war. This picture is the worst POW camp in the South. It's in Andersonville, Georgia. There was no shade. There was no shelter. All these men have are tents that they were able to put up themselves. Exposure, overcrowding, a lack of food, and disease killed more than 100 men a day during the summer of 1864. I think we talked about this once in class, how hot Georgia is in the summer. I know we think we know what hot is because we live in Phoenix. I have a sister who lives in Georgia, and I went to her wedding in June several years ago. And it was the most miserable weekend of my life. Yeah, it was only in the 90s, and to those of us who live here think, oh, that's not that bad. But the humidity is also in the 90s. It is the most uncomfortable I've ever been in my whole life. And that weekend I vowed I would never complain about Arizona's dry heat ever again. And I haven't. And actually, after the war ended, the commander of Andersonville's prison is the only person who was executed for war crimes after the Civil War. He was executed and charged with war crimes for his treatment of the prisoners in this Andersonville prison. You can go ahead and pause here if you need to finish the notes for this slide. This will conclude our lesson for today. Tomorrow we're going to watch another episode from America, The Story of Us. It's the episode about the Civil War. It's a really good episode. I think a lot of the things we learn about and discuss in class are good to have a visual, and they do a really good job describing how awful and destructive those Manet bullets are. So I hope you have a good day. I hope I see you Friday. And yeah, that's all I got for now. I'll see you later.